It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon when I got a call from my neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, a retired teacher who always kept an eye on the neighborhood. Her voice was urgent as she told me that a group of people had entered my backyard while I was at work, poking around my shed and inspecting my patio furniture like they had every right to be there. At first, I assumed it was maintenance workers or perhaps someone hired to do landscaping, but Mrs. Peterson insisted she recognized a few of them as members of our homeowners association. Confused and slightly alarmed, I immediately accessed my home security app and pulled up the camera footage. Sure enough, there they were, 3 middle-aged men and 1 woman, all wearing HOA name tags, strolling through my backyard like they owned the place. One of them even had a clipboard, scribbling down notes while another took pictures of my deck and flower beds. My stomach tightened with anger as I watched them peer into my windows, trying to get a look inside. They didn't knock. They didn't leave a notice. They simply trespassed onto my property as if my privacy meant nothing. That night, I scoured through my HOA agreement, looking for any clause that would justify their actions, but I found nothing. The next day, I stormed into the HOA office, demanding an explanation. The receptionist, an older woman with a pinched expression, barely looked up as she handed me a generic response about routine property assessments. Frustrated, I asked to speak to the HOA president, Mr. Langley, a smug, suit-wearing bureaucrat who always acted like he was running a small country instead of a suburban neighborhood. When I confronted him at the next board meeting, he smirked and dismissed my concerns, waving his hand as if I were overreacting. It's standard procedure, he claimed, brushing me off with an air of superiority. We're simply ensuring that all properties meet community guidelines. I pointed out that no notice had been given, no warning issued, and no permission granted, but he shrugged it off, making it clear that he believed the HOA had more power than individual homeowners. His arrogance only fueled my determination. That night, I began researching property laws, HOA regulations, and legal precedents for trespassing. The more I read, the more I realized just how badly they had overstepped their boundaries. Not only had they violated my rights, but they had also opened themselves up to potential lawsuits. Armed with this knowledge, I decided I wasn't going to let this slide. It was time to fight back. I didn't sleep much the night after I confronted the HOA. The sheer arrogance in Mr. Langley's voice, the way he had so casually dismissed my concerns like I was some nuisance rather than a homeowner with rights, left a bitter taste in my mouth. Every time I closed my eyes, I replayed the security footage in my head. 4 board members prowling through my backyard like they had every right to be there, taking notes, snapping photos, and whispering among themselves. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. If they did it to me, who else in the neighborhood had they violated? How long had they been pulling stunts like this? More importantly, what exactly had they been looking for? I spent the next morning researching property laws and HOA regulations. The deeper I dug, the more obvious it became that they had crossed multiple legal lines. Trespassing laws in my state were clear. Entering someone's private property without permission was illegal unless they had explicit consent or an emergency justification. The HOA, no matter how powerful they thought they were, had no such authority. Furthermore, my HOA's own bylaws required a formal notice before any property inspections. There was no loophole, no vague clause allowing for unannounced snooping. They had broken the rules plain and simple. Determined to hold them accountable, I scheduled a meeting with a local attorney who specialized in property law. His name was Daniel Keene, a sharp, no-nonsense man in his early 50s with graying hair and an impressive record of taking down overreaching HOAs. I walked into his office armed with printed copies of my security footage, HOA bylaws, and state property laws. As I laid everything out in front of him, he watched the footage with a frown, occasionally nodding as I detailed the events. When the video ended, he leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers. "This is bad," he said. "Really bad for them. They had no legal right to enter your property, and from what I can see, they weren't just inspecting. They were gathering evidence for something. If they were checking for violations, they still had to notify you first. No notice means they trespassed, plain and simple. That's exactly what I thought, I said, my anger flaring again. What are my options here? Daniel leaned forward. First, we file an official complaint with the HOA. They need to acknowledge their actions and explain themselves in writing. If they ignore it or try to justify their behavior, we escalate to the city, to law enforcement, and if necessary, to a civil lawsuit. But before we go nuclear, let's give them the chance to do the right thing. Just be prepared. These HOA types don't like to admit they're wrong. I nodded, already knowing that the likelihood of a sincere apology from Langley and his cronies was slim to none. That afternoon, Daniel helped me draft a formal complaint, citing the trespassing laws and outlining the violations in clear legal language. I emailed it directly to the HOA's office and sent physical copies via certified mail, ensuring there was no way they could claim ignorance. Days passed, and there was nothing but silence. No acknowledgement, no response. I wasn't surprised. I knew their game. They were hoping I'd get tired and let it go. What they didn't realize was that I had no intention of backing down. If anything, their refusal to respond only fueled my determination. By the end of the week, I escalated the complaint to the city's housing authority, including a copy of my security footage as evidence. Within 48 hours, I received a call from a city inspector named Lisa Carpenter. She was sharp and professional, with a no-nonsense attitude that immediately reassured me. I reviewed the footage you submitted, and it's clear that the HOA violated both their own bylaws and local property laws, she told me. We're going to launch an official investigation. In the meantime, I highly recommend you file a police report for trespassing. If the HOA continues to ignore you, legal action may be necessary. That was all I needed to hear. The next morning, I drove straight to the local police station and filed a formal trespassing complaint against the HOA board members who had entered my property. The officer taking my report listened carefully, asked detailed questions, and then assured me that my case would be reviewed. While I knew this wouldn't lead to immediate arrests, it sent a clear message. I wasn't playing games. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. Mrs. Peterson, who had first alerted me to the trespassing, was livid when she heard how the HOA had brushed me off. They think they can do whatever they want, she huffed over coffee one morning. It's about time someone stood up to them. Apparently, I wasn't the only one who had problems with the HOA's overreach. Within days, neighbors began approaching me, sharing their own horror stories, unjust fines, sudden rule changes, and even other instances of unauthorized property inspections. A group of us decided to attend the next HOA meeting together, determined to confront them as a united front. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a beige, windowless building that felt as lifeless as the HOA's policies. Langley sat at the head of the table, flanked by the same board members who had trespassed on my property. As soon as the meeting opened for homeowner concerns, I stood up. I filed a formal complaint last week regarding the unauthorized inspection of my property. I said loudly, not only did the HOA fail to respond, but I've now reported the incident to the city and local law enforcement. I want answers now. Langley's smug demeanor faltered slightly, but he quickly recovered. As I said before, all inspections are conducted in the interest of maintaining community standards. You didn't give me notice, I shot back. You didn't get my permission. That's trespassing. The city agrees. So, does my lawyer. Murmurs rippled through the audience. Some homeowners nodded in agreement, while others whispered among themselves. Langley's face darkened. Look, we have authority under the HOA agreement. No, you don't, I interrupted. I read the bylaws. Nowhere does it say the HOA can enter private property without permission. The city inspector is already looking into it, and the police have my formal trespassing complaint on file. The murmurs grew louder. A few people outright gasped. I could see the board members shifting uncomfortably, realizing that this wasn't going away quietly. Then one of my neighbors, a man named Carlos, stood up. "I had the same thing happen to me last year," he said. "I came home to find my backyard gate wide open. They never admitted to it, but I know it was them. Enough is enough." More people started speaking up. Stories of excessive fines, unfair enforcements, and other instances of HOA overreach poured out. The board members looked visibly shaken. Langley attempted to regain control, banging his gavel against the table, but the damage was done. As the meeting spiraled out of his control, I leaned forward, my voice calm but firm. "I'm giving you one last chance to address this properly before legal action escalates further. Either the HOA takes responsibility and ensures this never happens again, or we take this to court." Walking out of that HOA meeting, I knew I had rattled them. But I also knew people like Langley didn't just back down without a fight. The way his face tightened when I mentioned legal action told me everything. I had backed him into a corner, but he was the kind of man who would rather fight dirty than admit defeat. That was fine. I was prepared for that, too. The next morning, my lawyer, Daniel Keene, called me back with news. "I've drafted a formal legal notice," he said. "We're sending it to the HOA today. It outlines the violations they've committed: trespassing, privacy invasion, and failure to adhere to their own bylaws. We're demanding a full public apology, a revision of their inspection policies, and financial compensation for damages, including legal fees." I couldn't help but smirk at the thought of Langley reading that letter. "What if they refuse?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "Then we escalate," Daniel said simply. "We take it to court, and believe me, a judge is not going to look kindly on their behavior. Given the security footage and the city inspector's report, we have a strong case. But my guess? They'll try to stall, hoping you'll drop it." They'd try to stall. I didn't drop it. Days turned into a week, and there was still no formal response from the HOA. What did happen, however, was an increase in pettiness. Suddenly, I was getting violation notices in the mail for the most ridiculous things. My garbage bins weren't pulled in quickly enough, my grass was too long despite being freshly cut, and my car was improperly parked in my own driveway. The pettiness didn't stop with me. Other neighbors who had spoken out at the meeting started receiving their own warnings and fines. Mrs. Peterson got one for a non-compliant garden gnome. Carlos got hit with a porch clutter violation for having a single potted plant on his steps. The HOA was making it clear: if we fought back, they would make life miserable for us. What they didn't realize was that their retaliation only made things worse for them. The more fines they issued, the angrier people became. Before long, the entire neighborhood was buzzing with resentment. A petition started circulating, demanding an independent audit of the HOA's practices and a vote to remove Langley from his position. The petition gained signatures faster than anyone expected, and soon the board found themselves on the defensive. Then came the real blow. The city's housing authority completed its investigation. The findings were damning. Not only had the HOA illegally entered my property, but they had also conducted similar unauthorized inspections on at least 3 other homes. The city levied heavy fines against the HOA for their violations, and the police formally issued a warning regarding the trespassing complaints. And then, finally, the HOA's official response came in. It was an absolute joke. A vague, half-hearted letter that claimed misunderstandings had occurred and that they regret any inconvenience. No apology, no policy changes, nothing but empty words meant to make the issue go away. Daniel read it and laughed. "They must really think you're stupid," he said, shaking his head. "They're trying to dodge accountability. That's not going to work." I agreed. It was time to take the gloves off. That same day, Daniel filed a lawsuit against the HOA on my behalf. The charges included trespassing, privacy invasion, and harassment through retaliatory fines. The lawsuit wasn't just about me anymore. It was about standing up for every homeowner who had been bullied by the HOA's unchecked power. The lawsuit sent shockwaves through the community. Local news stations picked up the story, and within days, A reporter was knocking on my door, asking for an interview. I wasn't the only one. Carlos and Mrs. Peterson also agreed to speak, sharing their experiences with the HOA's overreach. The pressure became unbearable for Langley and his cronies. Under the mounting legal threat and public scrutiny, the board members began turning on each other. A few resigned outright, hoping to distance themselves from the scandal. Others tried to defend their actions, but their excuses fell flat. The final nail in the coffin came when a judge ruled in my favor, awarding me damages for legal fees and emotional distress. The HOA was also ordered to revise their inspection policies, ensuring that no future unauthorized inspections would occur without proper notice and homeowner consent. The fallout didn't end there. The petition to remove Langley gained enough traction to force a recall vote. He fought hard to keep his position, but the community had had enough. In a decisive vote, he was ousted from the board along with two of his staunchest supporters. With new leadership in place, sweeping changes were made. Unjust fines were overturned. Policies were rewritten to protect homeowners' rights, and new oversight measures were put in place to prevent future abuses of power. For the first time in years, people in the neighborhood felt like they actually had a voice. The victory was sweet, but the message was even sweeter. HOAs couldn't just trample over homeowners' rights without consequences. What started as a single act of trespassing had turned into a full-scale revolt against an overreaching board, and in the end, justice had prevailed. And as for Langley, the last I heard, he had moved out of the neighborhood entirely. Apparently, he couldn't handle living in a community where he no longer had unchecked power. Good riddance.